Welcome to episode 68 of the Autism Outreach Podcast. I am your host, Rose Griffin, and buckle up. You are in for a treat today. We had an amazing speech language pathologist by the name of Annie DiVello come on to the show and talk to us all about selective mutism. Selective mutism is something that we may see from time to time, and sometimes it can be hard to know how to best support our learners. And Annie shares so many wonderful strategies and talking points. She talks about how we need to have a round table of support for our students who have selective mutism, that it's not something that just one member of the team can help our learners with. She also talks about us as speech language pathologists being our students' brave voice coach. And I just love that so much. Annie shares strategies for working with younger students, and she also shares strategies for working with older students as well. And I love the phrase she uses that there is always a way forward. I think sometimes when we're working with a student with selective mutism or a student with any other type of complex communication need, it can feel very overwhelming when we're in the trenches and when we're working with students. But Annie is an absolute bright spot in the field of speech pathology. She has a very positive outlook and she shares some very actionable tips and strategies that you can start using in your next session.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on episode 68. We have an amazing episode today. Today, we have with us Annie DiVello. Thanks so much for joining us. It's amazing to have you on.
Oh, thank you for having me, Rose. Such a pleasure to be here.
And I think, I wanted to do a talk about selective mutism because it's something that I'm always trying to learn more about. And I think I just posted in one of my Facebook groups that is a nice positive one that I'm in on Facebook. There's not a whole lot that are that way. And I think your name came up and I looked on your website. And so I'm excited to be able to talk with you today. I know this is a topic you're very passionate about. So selective mutism is what we're going to be talking about today. But for those of us that are new to you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about you and kind of your journey to being a speech therapist, how you started specializing in this area?
Absolutely. So touch on my bio a little bit too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Perfect. So I graduated from West Virginia University in 2007. And I, even back then, was intrigued about selective mutism. And I think, like many speech pathologists, we briefly touched on the topic in grad school. But at that time, the thought was really that it's, a mental health disorder and that speech pathologists are not actively involved. And I think about some of the other paradigm shifts in the field, like feeding, and how there are so many now shared etiologies, selective mutism being one. But even back then, I was super intrigued about selective mutism. I graduated from WVU and I moved to South Central Los Angeles. I lived there in beautiful Marina Del Rey, but worked in Compton, 109th Street Elementary and Watts were my two schools. And it was, a big culture shock for a young lady who grew up in West Virginia. And but I learned a lot about culture and diversity and second language learning while I was there. And then I moved down to Atlanta to have the Southern experience. And then I came up to New England in 2008. Worked with a lot of different ages, birth to 3 as a home visitor. I've done some per diem hours in skilled nursing and worked with folks up to 104 years old. I love working with the elderly and hearing their stories and their journeys. but ultimately found my way to private practice so I could have a little bit more freedom and a little bit less bureaucracy than some of the other settings have. The red tape kind of suffocates me a little bit. So
Yeah.
found my way to private practice, and was working with a child who had a language delay. And the child had a sibling who would only whisper in front of me. And I worked with them for years and walked alongside the family as they went through their journey of receiving that diagnosis of selective mutism, and watching how hard that family had to work to find supports. And so at that time, I had never worked with a child that had SM. I wasn't sure about my role as a speech pathologist in the treatment of SM, but I said to them, gosh, if you really can't find anybody, I'd be happy to take you on, but I'll need to get consultative support. I'll need to read all the books, and you need to know that this is brand new for me. But if you can't find other support, I'm really happy to try my best to help you. And they said, oh, that'd be wonderful. So I called ASHA and said, who is here in New Hampshire, or nearby, who can support me? And they said, oh, top expert, Dr. Jolene Fernald is right there in Dover, New Hampshire. So I reached out to Jolene, who I can now call a dear colleague of mine, just a wonderful person, and asked her if she would provide mentorship and support for me. And she was so gracious to do that, and quickly started sending more children my way. And it's the type of specialty that once the word gets out that that's what you do, the phone never stops ringing, because there aren't a lot of folks providing that specialized support. And so I started taking every training. If there was a training, I was buying an airplane ticket and flying to go take that training, and learned from so many amazing leaders in the field. Dr. Steve Kurtz, Dr. Rachel Bussman, Amy Gutschbrett, Thriving Minds, Carolyn Eccles, so many more, Evelyn Klein and Cesar Ruiz. And started taking every training on anxiety that I could, and started working really closely with a clinical psychologist or a feelings helper, and started sharing my whole caseload and really working with that team approach. And definitely saw very quickly that this is exactly where I belong and exactly what I want to be doing. So as you notice from my website, is exclusively what I do these days for the most part. And I started realizing too, just how little supports there are for selective mutism and how much misunderstanding. So became very passionate about providing education and advocacy for selective mutism. So I took on the role as the volunteer coordinator for the Selective Mutism Association here in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. So families will call and I'll help get them connected to supports. And then I started providing trainings for school teams, because I found not only were speech pathologists really struggling to understand their role, to understand what SM is, to try to help these students, but school teams are struggling as well. And they desperately want to support these students, but have such a lack of resources to do that. And if we think about we could say, rather abundant resources for autism, for students who are visually impaired, students who are deaf or hard of hearing. But when it comes to SM, schools just don't have that same number of resources. So I started working on providing trainings, and very quickly school teams across the nation started finding my name. And so I would get calls.
Nice.
Can you come, these days via web conference and provide a training for our team. So that's a huge part of what I do, and something I really love doing.
That's great, because there really is not a lot of information out there. I know when I started working with a student with selective mutism, I think I just, I do a lot of presentations for speechpathology.com. So I was like, hey, can I take a couple courses here? And so, that's where I started. But I was lucky enough to partner with another kind of expert type center, because it really is just hard to figure out, how you can best support students. But for people who may not know what selective mutism is, can you just give us kind of a working definition of what it really is?
Absolutely. So it is essentially a social phobia, a phobia of speaking, but a phobia with very complex neurophysiological components and many, many more comorbidities than a quote unquote typical phobia would come with. So, for example, a child that has a spider phobia, and spiders are just the scariest thing imaginable for that child, that may be the only thing going on for that child. And not to minimize that experience, that's a terrible experience to have that spider phobia, but that might be all that's going on for them. But conversely, a child with selective mutism, comorbidities are recognized to be the rule and not the exception. So we're typically talking about a child that has this phobia of speaking. So speaking to new people in new settings, perhaps with a specific activity. An SM can be specific to a person, a place, or an activity, or multiple variables. There's typically SM and selective mutism and a generalized anxiety disorder, selective mutism and social anxiety, selective mutism and a speech and language disorder. And so for us as speech language pathologists, that's so imperative to hold in the very forefront of our mind, because the current research would suggest that anywhere between 63 and 71% of students that have selective mutism have one or more differences in their speech and language capacities. So that could be an articulation disorder, it could be apraxia, it could be a language disorder, something under that giant umbrella. And selective mutism expert Evelyn Klein has talked a lot about how high the prevalence of fluency and selective mutism tends to be, which makes sense because fluency is also an anxiety-based disorder.
Wow, that's interesting, because as a school-based SLP, I'm thinking of my assessment piece, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit, but sometimes it's hard to know. And I didn't know that about the comorbidities, but sometimes the assessment piece is so very difficult, because if school is a place where the student is not verbalizing and you're doing the assessment, it really gets hard to know, how do I support this student? It's definitely a group effort. That's what I've learned over, my 20 years as a speech therapist and working with some kids here and there who have this. So you've talked about how it is a collaborative effort. Who is on the team usually for a student who has selective mutism?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because the current framework for ASHA, they really have placed forth a call to action for speech pathologists to be working as a collaborative team effort. They do not want us working in isolation. Just like with autism, auditory processing, they very much want that evaluation, management, counseling, advocacy to be from a team approach. And due to the comorbidities, that makes an awful lot of sense, right? We really can't be effective alone, because there are so many areas of need that are beyond our scope of practice. So a critical part of that care team is absolutely, I like to think about it like a round table of support where everyone has an equal and important role, including the student and the parent or caregiver. But other important seats, of course, include a mental health professional, because we are talking at the very least, even if there are no other comorbidities, and certainly in a small percentage of these children, that is true. There is still that anxiety-based disorder of selective mutism. So we really need that mental health expert. And if we think about the 5 criteria in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition, that defines selective mutism, that 5th criteria is that that lack of speaking cannot be better explained by social anxiety nor other psychiatric differences. Well, we as speech pathologists, we really can't look at that. And it just comes back to just how important it is to work within that team framework. So ideally, there's going to be that feelings doctor or that mental health expert on the team. Certainly the classroom teacher. Oh my goodness, who spends more time during the school day than the classroom teacher? So they have such an important role in that support process, and especially when we get to working on generalizing the brave voice back to the classroom. And depending on the student, there may be other support people as well. I think of us as speech language pathologists and the science of speech language pathology. I think of your students, Rose, that have autism. We always start with that initial assessment, so we can really understand our student, who they are, what all their strengths are, and certainly what their needs may be. And when I think about how complex many autistic students are, there's so many different supports in place depending on that student's needs and their profile. And it's the same with selective mutism.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering as a school-based, I am school-based therapist 3 days a week, and then 2 days a week I have my own company. But I like the idea of the feelings doctor. I'm writing a lot of notes over here diligently. I like all the things you're saying. So in a public school, what have you seen as far as the makeup of, is that person usually somebody that is within the district, or are they utilizing somebody as an outside support for that piece, for that mental health component?
Yeah, great question. I only coach school teams and consult with school teams and do direct supports for school teams in the 4 states in which I'm licensed: New Hampshire, Vermont, Mass, and Maine. However, I do provide trainings and workshops, webinars for school teams across the nation. So I hear about their plans, but I don't advise them because I'm not licensed in those states. But for the states that I hear about, I had the opportunity to provide a wonderful training for a large district in California, and they were talking to me about some of their programming, or even thinking about here in New Hampshire, even within one district in one state, there's so much variability. And I think about students with augmentative communication needs. Some schools have an expert in-house where they can do that evaluation, they can do programming, they can do monthly progress monitoring. Some districts will bring that consultant or that expert in. And so the same with selective mutism. I do find that a lot of districts end up reaching out for consultative support and accessing different experts across the nation. And certainly I have found that to be, for the school teams here in New England, I get an awful lot of calls from schools looking to work collaboratively with me to help support their students with selective mutism.
Oh, that's awesome. So if we're going to do an assessment and we're the speech therapist on the team, what are some ways that the speech therapist can help out with that assessment piece? I guess I'm thinking of a student that maybe they're talking in a whisper at school, maybe they're not talking in school at all. So I feel like that gets tricky, right? Because just like autism, is a continuum and everybody is presenting differently. I know that selective mutism is the same, but what if you have a student who is not verbalizing in the school environment, or their verbalizations are limited in that location?
Yeah, absolutely. And Rose, I think that might be the number one question asked by speech pathologists. And I certainly have had so many wonderful conversations about how we do that. So what a great topic to visit. Because the third criteria for selective mutism in the DSM specifies, the fourth, that not speaking, the lack of speaking cannot be attributable to a lack of comfort with the spoken language, nor to underlying speech and language deficits. Speech pathologists have a critical role in the evaluation, because how would a clinical psychologist evaluate speech and language capacities, or to begin to understand or explore the very natural and developmental silent acquisition phase of second language learning? So we have such a critical role. But how do we do that, as you said, for a student who isn't speaking? Because we're always considering, are we looking at performance, or are we looking at skills and abilities? And we never, ever want to measure performance. We always say in our test reports, right? We either believe or do not believe that students' performance represents, their true skills and abilities, and these test results can be valid and are considered accurate, or because of these reasons, we can't, right? So how do we do that? A lot of it depends on the age. I tend to find that for the littles, so really up to age 8, maybe even flirting a little bit higher, we can ask mom and dad to get a great video of a fun family game night at home. I never, ever like to be anything less than fully transparent with students. I never like to trick or deceive students. But for those students that do have high levels of comorbidities, they have significant social anxiety and more other, we might have to get mom or dad to kind of take that on the sly. Maybe, or maybe we've got mom facilitating the game and we have other mom taking the video. But most kids are really happy to be on video. And it's just not a problem. But we want to try to get that video from home. Now, if that has been taken in secrecy because it had to be, we never, ever want for that to come back to the student that we've watched it, because they would feel so violated. But if we have to come to understand what their speech and language capacities are, and if that is a part of their struggle, sharing their brave voice with others, we might have to kind of explore some of those roads. Never the first way we want to go, but we might have to. So we want to watch that video from home. I do these days typically about 4 comprehensive evaluations a month collaboratively with a school team. Just yesterday I was sitting and transcribing a video from home and writing down what this little cherub was saying line for line so that I could look at T units. I could look at articulation, phonology, fluency, voice, social language, total lexicon. And I learned so much about this child and their capacities. This child was just thrilled to be on camera. They kept giving this dazzling smile. They would pause in the game and go,
that's cute.
They were so excited to be on video. So I did believe that they were not feeling nervous and it was representative of their true skills and abilities. And I asked the parents, is this typical? Is this what language sounds like? And their articulation and whatnot when they're playing. I said, absolutely. So I did believe it to be representative. And I did not know anything abnormal, just some developmental articulation errors, a little D for TH voiceless, some pre-vocalic and post-vocalic R errors, very young child, nothing unusual, completely intelligible speech, wonderful lexicon, beautiful use of humor and social language, reciprocity, fabulous. But for some students, if we can't get that video and we can't get that, so type of information, if we're talking about, let's say, a 16-year-old who hasn't spoken in school for 11 years and has extreme social anxiety, is not going to let mom video, we might have to do lots of parent interviewing. Tell me what a conversation sounds like with your child. Do you notice any differences in sound? Do you ever hear like wed wound wabbit instead of red round rabbit? Or do you ever hear ball or ball instead of ball? Or we might model some different, and parents typically know if their child's voice, articulation, language sounds different. Many parents have more than one child at home, and so they're comparing them to their siblings. Sometimes those pieces go unnoticed, but we're typically able to get that information. So it gives us some great ideas. Now, so that's a really important piece. And then comes the direct testing with the student. Now, it's a huge continuum because we can diagnose selective mutism within a team approach, not solely a speech pathologist, but with that multidisciplinary team as early as 30 months or 2.5 years. Oh, wow. Once that developmental phase of 18 to 24 months, stranger danger, kind of naturally dissipates. But so compare a 30-month-old child to an 18-year-old young adult. Oh my goodness, there's such a continuum. But for that direct testing time with the student, I like to look, much like students with autism, what do their functional, emotional, developmental capacities look like? Can this student share attention? Can they engage and relate with me? Can they open and close circles of communication non-verbally? Nodding their head, shaking their head, pointing, thumbs up, thumbs down, or are even those capacities restricted? In the current diagnostic statistical manual, depression can be diagnosed in the toddler years. So we can certainly be looking at a 2.5, 3.5-year-old child that has, again, depending on their profile, severe selective mutism. So if I were to administer the Selective Mutism questionnaire by the amazing Dr. Lindsay Bergman, or the Frankfurt scales, which have recently been developed and are currently being normed in the United States for English-speaking students. If that degree of speech inhibition is really strong, that's meaningful. If they are very, very anxious, we don't diagnose anxiety until age 5 when metacognition really kicks in, but we can certainly have a child experiencing anxiety in the toddler years and the infant years. We can have an anxious infant, not an infant with an anxiety disorder, but we can have a very anxious infant. We can also have a depressed toddler. So if that child cannot engage with me, I already know we're looking at SM and. And that's really important because that's not the type of student who's only experiencing struggle turning their brave voice on at school. That's a child that probably can't order their own ice cream at the ice cream stand with dad, or probably can't let the cashier know how old they are when she's, flirting at the checkout at Walmart. And, oh, little girl, you're so cute. How old are you? She probably isn't holding up her fingers. And so we want to look at that. Conversely, if that student can engage with me so readily, can access nonverbal communication, that tells me a lot too, right? By age 5, I am administering self-questionnaires and motivational interviewing. We know metacognition really kicks in by age 5. We might have to dial the language back. And I think as speech language pathologists, we're so versed in language and that hierarchy of language. We do that really naturally, right? And we do that with our tests and test instructions all the time. So I might dial that language back, but I really want to get a sense of what this experience is like for them and their perspective of the experience. Certainly by age 8 onward, they're doing their own self-questionnaires, and maybe that's with support. No demands to verbally communicate with me, but I want to really understand their experience within this experience because it's so student specific. So every child with SM has a phobia of speaking, but to a different degree and for different reasons. And we always want to hold that individuality and remember that if we've met one student with selective mutism, we've met one student with selective mutism, just like autism.
Yeah. I think what is probably tricky as a student gets older, and we're going to talk about some functional goal setting and things like that, but the mental health piece is such a big part of the puzzle here for the team. And, I work in a middle school, high school level. So in just in general, that part of your development, sometimes people are not freely sharing, which I'm sure can be a barrier, right, to that child making progress. But if you have somebody who is working with the feelings doctor, as you've been saying, which I love that, sounds so warm and fuzzy. I need a feelings doctor. They're working with the feelings doctor. It's going to kind of be a barrier to any type of progress, maybe with verbalizing in different places, if that's hard for the student, if they're not verbalizing with that doctor or whoever is providing the mental health guidance. Have you seen that too, where a student is really struggling as they get older to be open about what that journey is like for them?
I have not found that to be true. Even with the most severe teens and young adults into their 20s with whom I have worked, I have found that via taking the time to build the relationship, provide psychoeducation for them about their struggle, and via motivational interviewing with no demands to communicate, that even the most severe students that I have seen have been so able and so, I would say, joyful to share their experience with me via written means, that they will, and I say that because they write so much on the motivational interviewing and questionnaires, and they'll often create their own rating system. Most of my questionnaires are a 5-point Likert scale from 0 to 4, and they'll often write out 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and circle 12 and underline it, and then write, students have stopped speaking to me for 7 years now, or like they'll write in these clarifying statements where it's almost like they feel this tremendous sense of relief to finally get to share their story. And for some, they're feeling heard for the first time. And it feels good to talk about the struggle and to have that normalized and have that named and to be given that message of hope that they're not alone in this and that there is a road forward, and showing them video clips of other teens and young adults who've made this journey, talking to them about author Jonathan Kohlmeyer and his memoir, Learning to Play the Game. And for some of them, even connecting them with Jonathan or us Zooming together so that they meet a young adult. Now, am I telling you that they're sitting down and we're singing Kumbaya and they're telling me their journey with their brave voice? Rose, by no means. But I'm saying if you take the time to build the relationship and you use motivational interviewing and you allow them the nonverbal needs and remove all demands to talk to you, these students are thrilled to have their say and to feel like they matter for the first time in their life, maybe.
Right. Oh, that's powerful. I love that. Yeah, that's really great. So if we are listening as a school-based speech therapist or, clinic owner, and we do have a child who we think has selective mutism, and we kind of go through the process that you've discussed about assessment, I was hoping that you could just share, and I know it's not as easy as, just telling us some goals, but, can you discuss like maybe some functional goal ideas, or how do we get started in therapy, just as a way for people, if they're listening and they start thinking about a kid and they're like, oh man, this is, this kid's whispering at school now. And why is this happening? And, having this team-based approach, how can we get started in helping to support that child or student once we've kind of have that assessment piece underway?
Yeah, Absolutely. And I think for school teams, I always love to remind school teams that they are so knowledgeable, they're so capable, and they build multi-tiered systems of supports, 504s, IEPs all the time for students with inexplicably complex needs. So never to forget that and to think back to that structure, comprehensive eval, whether that's a student who moves into the district with complex autism, Down syndrome, charge syndrome, selective mutism. We start with that comprehensive team eval and come to understand who is this student and what are their needs. Then we move into determining eligibility. For students with selective mutism, we want to be thinking as speech language pathologists about criterion point 3 in the DSM for that diagnosis, that the impact on social communication. Oh my goodness, if you are a student at school without a voice, your pragmatic communication is significantly impacted. So under IDEA Part B, of course, we're thinking about that speech and language and that social communication. Depending on the student, we might be thinking about other needs as well. And we're always remembering under FAPE that we're talking about qualifying under academic and or social emotional needs. So some students with autism may be functioning perfectly academically, but maybe they have social emotional needs. I'm sure you've seen that, Rose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Same with selective mutism. So we want to think about that. So we determine that eligibility. Then we want to build that team. We have to define roles. If we don't have, as you mentioned earlier, that SM expert in-house, we want to bring that person in. And there are some amazing options out there nationally for that support. And then we want to implement the plan and that monthly progress monitoring, just like we do for other students. I think sometimes school teams forget just how capable and competent they are. And they feel like students with selective mutism fall into this other category. And yes, of course, their needs are different than a child with a specific learning disability or autism, but so much is still the same in terms of that plan, in terms of the eligibility, in terms of the monthly progress monitoring. So we want to be holding that large construct. And then in terms of functional goals, of course, we want to work on their communication, comfort, and confidence. Whether that's a student who's whispering, whether that's a student who isn't speaking at all, whether that's that student that will use 1 or 2 words to consistently respond if asked a direct question, but never turns their brave voice on across the whole rest of their day. We want to work on that communication, comfort, and confidence. So that looks like one-on-one work with a key worker outside of the classroom setting. Now they're going to have to choose a method, and there are different methods out there. I use an integrated team approach. There are other wonderful options out there, and it's important for key workers to be aware of that. Regardless of the method, for the most part, and there are some exceptions there across different modalities, once we've chosen a method, then we're talking about making that decision to move forward with stimulus fading or shaping. So their stimulus fading would be generalizing that student's voice from a caregiver to that key worker. Mm-hmm. So Rose, if you were going to be the key worker for that student, maybe you schedule with dad for him to come and meet you in the morning for 10 minutes before school starts, mm-hmm. and to help bring that brave voice into your room when it's empty. And mm-hmm. then maybe day 2 is in that empty room, but maybe your door is open and maybe you walk by the door once. And then maybe day 3, you walk into the room and then out again. And then maybe day 4, you hang out in the room for a few minutes. And then maybe day 5, you stay in the room and you're even commenting on that play. And day 6, maybe you're even starting to ask the questions. But we are talking about small steps programming, gradual exposure and desensitization. And we're remembering that we're talking about a phobia. So we want to be really careful not to fall into rapid exposure and too much too soon. We are asking the student to do the scariest thing imaginable. Now, depending on the student, there's a lot of considerations there, whether or not they're a candidate, that, whether or not the parent is available, whether or not they can come into the school, are the numbers high for COVID, are they low? Is that even possible? What does this look like? I don't know. Yeah. But if it's not a possibility for one or more reasons, no problem. Plan B is shaping or the communication ladder. So from that initial evaluation, we've determined the point of the breakdown in the communication, and then we build there. So if it is engaging and relating, maybe we're building a puzzle together. If it's nonverbal communication, maybe we're just working on playing Candyland and just flipping that card and taking our turn and moving our player, right? It's step by step. We come right up the communication ladder. Now, this is going to depend a lot on the age, how that looks and how that goes, how you're introducing that to the student. But irregardless of whether that's a 30-month-old student in the preschool or a 17-year-old in the high school, it's still small steps programming, and it's still a collaborative process, and it's still a team approach. And as you mentioned earlier, it's very much an anxiety-based disorder. So as we, the speech language pathologists, are guiding that student up the communication ladder, oh no, there's a giant worry bully on the loose who's really impacting the way in which that student can engage with us and turn their brave voice on. And Rose, you and I, as speech language pathologists, we don't happen to have a dragon slaying bow and arrow in our speech bag. Or at least I don't. Oh, Rats is right. But your school counselor, your school psychologist, your school social worker, they're always packing. So always remember that you have that support to assist you, and you can carry over those anxiety coping strategies. Think of all the strategies you carry over for your other students: visual strategies, postural strategies, sensory strategies, so on and so forth. So we want to definitely be thinking about that. But we also want to be thinking about, how do we as the speech pathologists support that classroom teacher to get a total communication approach in place in the classroom, so that the student is participating and communicating to the maximum of their ability, while we're working on bringing them through the stages of confident speaking outside the classroom setting. I like to think about that like fluency. We start with fluency in our speech room, one-on-one, working up that hierarchy. We don't start by asking them to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Maybe we're working on one-word phrases and easy onsets, or whatever strategies we have determined are appropriate and warranted outside the classroom. And then we slowly ask the classroom teacher to help us generalize that in. Maybe the student starts practicing their one-word response during math, and we've co-created that plan with them, and the teacher's on board. Same with SM. But we want to have that total communication approach in place for the student who stutters and is unintelligible, for the child with selective mutism without a voice, so they have a way to communicate while they're doing that important work with us outside the classroom.
I love that. And I think if you're listening and you're school-based, I think the thing that might feel scary is that you may not encounter as many kids with selective mutism. So I think it's really great, the framework that you're dealing with and talking about. And I think as a school-based clinician, what has helped me is being able to talk to somebody like you, who really is an expert in this area. Because what is really evident, and like working with an autistic child, is you do have to have a really cohesive team and a framework. And sometimes when you're in a school, there's so many different pieces and parts and moving people and, training levels and all of those things, that sometimes just getting this framework down of, like, number one, who's on the team? Number two, can we work with an expert in this area? Because it really just makes it so much easier, where you have such a wealth of information that it's like, if nobody understands what selective mutism is, you're just, it's really hard to get all this kind of in motion. It's almost like the outside consultant is really the leader and helping to develop what the framework is, and talking about the different roles. And I think I always say that too. I can't remember if I said that already on this podcast or it was the one I was just on, but I always think the most important part of my job as a speech therapist for my private clients or school is to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that we all understand, number one, who is on the team, which may seem simplistic, but when you are working with students with, a more complex needs, there are a lot of different players. Like you said, the round table, there's a lot of different people here. And number one, we need to know who's there, especially if you're a school-based therapist and maybe the child, are they getting private therapy? Do you know that? Can you talk to that person? Are they getting outside, mental health services? And just sometimes that's almost a barrier, that communication loop, especially for school-based and private, and making sure that everybody's kind of working together on the team. And then as the student gets older, it does get a little bit trickier because there are more teachers to talk to. There are more people. There's, guidance. There's, it just seems like as the student gets older, there seems to be more players, in there. And I'm wondering too, if you have any specific strategies for students who are older, if there's any, I'm doing a talk coming up here pretty soon talking about being a high school speech therapist. And so I get a lot of questions, mostly about autism, but, sometimes people reach out about other things and I say, well, I'm not the expert, but this is something I've been doing. But do you have any strategies that would be more dedicated or thinking about the older learner, like, beyond that 8 years of age?
Yeah, absolutely. The needs are different and much more complex. Anxiety-based disorders are recognized to be gateway disorders to other mental health differences. So if we're talking about unresolved SM, beyond the age of 7 is considered an advanced presentation of SM. By the time we get to the teen years, it's things are fairly complex. And that's not to say to parents, school teams, individuals themselves, that there is reason to give up hope. There's always a way forward, always. It's just going to take a little longer. I think of myself, here moving to New England, meeting my husband. He grew up skiing. His family, they're fabulous skiers. They think the Black Diamonds are awesome at Sugarloaf in Maine. I didn't. I grew up in West Virginia, and I didn't get on skis until I was in my 30s when I married him. And it's different than learning as a child. It's different as when you're older. Same with selective mutism. So it's going to take longer. It's going to be more complex, but there is a pathway forward. There is always hope. Some things we want to be holding in mind are that we have to be working within that team framework, and we have to define our roles. When schools will call me here in New England and say, will you come in? Will you consult with us? We really need your help. And I'll go in, and we're talking about amazing, wonderful, motivated people. And we start talking about these ideas of building a team, defining roles. Consistently, they'll tell me, that's so meaningful to us. We really miss that step. And it is such a barrier to progress. And that just makes sense, right? So we have to understand the students' complex needs. And if we're talking about the later years, we have to be talking about a brave voice vitamin or pharmaceuticals. So we have to get that family connected to that psychiatrist, because pediatricians are wonderful and skillful and expert, but they typically are not comfortable prescribing up into the therapeutic doses. And in the teenage years, I've seen that be as high as 375 milligrams of an SNRI. And so when we start to think about the SNRIs, all of the mood stabilizers and so on and so forth, in the teenage years, we're going to have to be up in the therapeutic doses. We're often talking about potentially more than one medication, and we potentially might get into some of what Craig Donnelly, lead psychiatrist at Dartmouth Hitchcock Lebanon, lecturer and professor at Harvard, talks about the big gun medications, things that we wouldn't necessarily go to as a first choice, like the benzodiazepines. I'm probably mispronouncing that. The pharmaceuticals are not my strong suit, Rose. I don't know about you, but we're going to need that medication piece, because if we're talking about selective mutism in the teenage years, we are definitely talking about more than just a phobia of speaking. We're talking about perhaps a persistent depressive disorder, perhaps generalized anxieties, but perhaps specific phobias. We might even be looking at some conduct differences, such as OCD, formerly considered an anxiety-based disorder, now considered a conduct-based disorder. But we're looking at so many complex mental health pieces that are going to impede the process. So in the teenage years, a lot of talk experts will say to parents, before we can ask your student to start this hard climb up the mountain, we have to make sure they have the appropriate climbing gear. And that's the pharmaceuticals. And certainly that makes sense to me, because I don't think any of us would send our teenage child up Mount Everest without their gear, their oxygen pack, their snacks, their tent, some foot warmers. And that's that pharmaceutical. We have to get that in place. The other piece, if the family's strongly opposed to that, and top expert, Dr. Steve Kurtz, says that, there is a small percentage of families that they just feel like it's not the right decision for them. And if they're not ready, then certainly we can move forward and measure for, maybe 8 weeks, maybe up to 12 weeks. But if there is no response to the intervention, coming at this from a no harm perspective, we cannot forge onward, whether we're talking about the schools, whether we're talking about private practice. We can't provide an intervention that has no chance of succeeding and is actually causing harm, because the student doesn't have what they need to safely engage in that process.
I like the idea of the climbing gear. Everything you say is so eloquent. I have a sheet and I have lots of notes here. I'm like, I love the way you talk about things, because it really is a way to equip ourselves that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it definitely does. And I do think, as with everything, I think as students get older, every type of disorder does get more complex, because the student is older, maybe what's functional, what's appropriate, what needs to be addressed, it kind of shifts and moves. But I'm thinking, like, on a very very simplistic level, okay, as a school-based speech therapist, if you're working with an older student, so you said beyond 7, do you suggest, and this is a simple question, Annie, but do you suggest, I'm kind of taking it back to the basics, do you suggest that a speech therapist see a student with selective mutism by themselves or in a group? And I'm only asking because I know for some school districts, I work in a really great school district, so I'm able to see the kids how, I think is best supporting them. But for some school space SLPs, they really are strapped with a very, very large caseload. So what are your thoughts on maybe frequency of time that a child may benefit from, and or is it great to see them individually? Is it good to see them individually and in a group? For some of my autistic learners, they do have some social concerns, but we are working on kind of language too. So I may see them once individually and then once in a group to kind of round all the basis of what they need. But do you have any general recommendations for a speech therapist that might be thinking, I would love to see the student by themselves. I think this is what they need. Is that really true? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. You asked the best questions, Rose. It's almost like you're a professional podcaster.
Hey, I'm trying.
So I think of the work of Michelle Garcia Winters, and she talks about a particular subcategory of children who are not boot camp, who are not group ready. She talks about them needing boot camp. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard her say that, right?
Yeah.
And I think about the autistic learners that you work with, Rose. You probably have met such students where they were always in our mind thinking about the group, because you and I know you cannot generalize social skills. You cannot generalize a brave voice just naturally, spontaneously from one-on-one. It's going to have to be systematic and learned within a group setting, of course. But our starting point can't always be the group. And so when we come to selective mutism, we want to think about that boot camp experience, just like Michelle Garcia Winters says, and then building to the group. And so, if we think about the minimum amount needed, we always explain to teens or tweens that we're working with that I'm like a brave voice coach. Some kids, they go to the gym and they work with a muscle coach who helps them build muscles and get stronger. And I'm like a brave voice coach. I'm going to help you to build brave voice muscles. But that means that we've got to work hard, because guess what, friend? Picking up a pencil, oops, that's not heavy enough or hard enough to build muscles. And we have to practice and train together a lot, because oops, if we go to the gym once a week, we're not going to build muscles and get stronger. So the same. So we're thinking about, in terms of frequency, minimum of 3 times a week, that repeated exposure and that desensitization. Ideally, in a perfect world, that's 5 days a week. But just like the gym, 3 will get it done. I would love to go to the gym 5 days a week. My schedule doesn't always allow that, but I get there 3 days a week and I stay super fit. But the brave voice muscles, we have to have that regular experience. So minimum of 3 times a week. Now, in the school setting, you and I both know that a 30-minute session also involves walking to the classroom, bringing the student back, getting settled, and getting back to the classroom. So when we're thinking about timing, we don't necessarily want to write 20 minutes in the IEP, because that leaves about 18 minutes of actual time in our room. So we usually are writing 30 minutes 3 times a week, one-on-one. And we know that IEPs, 504s are fluid documents. So once we're group ready, then we can amend to that group setting. And the idea is that we hope to get there quickly. Steve Kurtz talks about kind of national guidelines and expectations. If we're working with the stimulus fading, the idea is that you've established verbal behavior by the 6th session. It happens quickly. Now, if we're talking about the teenage years and we're talking about pharmaceuticals not yet in place, that's different. But the idea is that things move forward quickly. And the idea is certainly that we have reportable empirical progress every month when we do our monthly progress monitoring. Because if we think about a student who is suffering in indescribable ways across their day and missing hundreds, if not thousands of verbal opportunities, we don't want to hang out there for years. We're talking about missed academic learning. We're talking about missed social learning. We're talking about significant safety concerns. So we're talking about a student who doesn't have a voice. And we're also talking about a rather demoralizing experience, not being able to share one's thoughts and feelings and wonders and worries and likes and dislikes and everything in between. So it's a strap on your running shoes and head for the finish line, but also recognizing that we have to get there through small steps, programming, and gradual exposure. It has to be both.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. Such great information. Oh my goodness. I love it. I have a bunch of notes here. I really love all this information. I know this is really going to be helpful because I spend way too much time online, but there's always people that are asking questions about selective mutism. And I'm part of this middle school, high school group. And I feel like there's a lot of dialogue there. Just what is our role? How can I support this student? So I know a lot of people will really like this because now what I usually do in Facebook groups is say, I may not be an expert in that, but I did a podcast on it. So I'm going to share this with you. But thank you so much for joining us. And if people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find out about you?
Yeah, my website would be a great place to go. AnnieDiVello.com, just my first and last name. I'm always happy to hear from folks. That was something, took me a lot of years in the field to figure out that you can reach out. And it's great to reach out. If you're not in one of the states in which I'm licensed, I can't advise you on your student, but I'm happy to connect and to talk about selective mutism in general. I have, now that I am officially an ASHA CEU approved provider, I have a series of recorded trainings that I'm launching on my website. And I have a bunch of live trainings coming up this spring as well, which you can find all of the information regarding on my website. And I would love to hear from you. I very much take my role as the volunteer coordinator for SMA seriously, and I'm very committed to the advocacy of selective mutism and to empowering speech-language pathologists and speech-language assistants to feel confident and capable in their role at that round table of support.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Annie. It was really nice to meet you.
Thank you so much, Rose. You as well.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.